Well, for coming tonight, and it's really nice to see so many people here. And we got tickets for everybody, and that's been very nice. So thank you. I'm teasing. And what we're going to do is play one verse of the songs I wanted to talk about tonight, and then talk about it, and or more precisely about the author, Charles Wesley, and then at the end go back to play two verses. And so, first one is, "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing." One verse. Grace Community Church, Sun Valley, California, wherever that is.
That one play.
There we go.
Did you just want one?
Yeah, I think so. And then we'll play more later on. This is just to give you the tapes. Okay. Taste what's coming. Then next is Christ the Lord is risen today. We're experimenting here, but I think this will be fun. Fun for us. All right. Recognize that voice, huh? Remember those things? We'll go back to these. And the last is Hark the Herald Angels Sing. Different kinds of
Joyful all ye nations rise, join my triumph, this God is great, and champion comes from day. Christ is God, in the wrong. Just sing, glory to King.
Hey, thanks to John for doing this. It's an experiment. I've never done this, and it's like, it's new for everybody. But do you recognize there's one common thread in those three songs? A very big common thread. It's a common rope that binds them all. Yeah, I don't know. They're all written by the same man, and written by our progenitor, Charles Wesley. And as I'll talk about later, go on. Charles Wesley wrote 6,500 or so songs. And so this is, shall we say, a small sample of the 6,000. But this is my guess as to three of the most commonly sung and the ones that Methodists, most of us, I assume, are most familiar with. Okay. Well, thanks again for coming. And let me tell you what I have in mind for tonight and next Wednesday and the following Wednesday. Tonight, we talked about Charles Wesley, and who is near and dear to all of our hearts, Methodist. And then next Wednesday, I wanted to talk about Fanny Crosby. And she was not a Methodist. Actually, she had no particular denomination, broadly evangelical. But Fanny Crosby is a remarkable woman, too. She was blind from the age of 2 at the end of her life. She lived into her high 90s. And she wrote more than 9,000 canvas. And it's remarkable how she did that. Sometimes she dictated 12 hymns at a time. Now, I don't mean simultaneously, but one verse here, and the scribe would write them, and as that scribe is writing it, another scribe would start writing. It's incredible mind how this happens. And then the last Wednesday, we're going to switch approaches. And I propose to talk about 6 songs, not the authors so much, but the songs themselves. And each of them, there's a rationale behind it. We'll start with Mighty Fortress is Our God, which is pretty much the marching hymn for Protestants. And then, let's see, I should have written them down. Yeah. But they will come. They will come by 2 weeks from tonight. That's written down. All right. Anyway, 6 of the most commonly sung hymns that have governed our worship life. So we're going to do this in different ways. Last week we talked about Amazing Grace, one song, now 2 authors, and then lastly the songs themselves. All right. As soon as I can find them. All right. Tonight, Charles Wesley, and a person I especially like. And as you'll see, mine some very, very appealing personality traits. But along the way here, actually to start, we need to talk about John Wesley, his older brother. And the reason is because in many ways he shaped Charles. Charles basically inherited John's outlook on the world, his theological system. And so what we see in Charles's hymn writing is in many ways a continuation of what John thought. So we have to start really with John Wesley. That's okay. He's really our progenitor. Before we start with John Wesley, however, we need to start with the Church of England. And we're in the 18th century here. And all of England, or most of England, was marked by the Church of England, which came to be known as Anglicanism, and the United States, the Protestant Episcopal Church. Okay. Now, what is key for us to understand is the Church of England embraced everybody. It is the Church of England. And Queen Elizabeth intended for it to be the church that embraced all the English people. And that's how it came to be called the Anglican Church, because Anglos, okay? And there are a lot of benefits to that. I mean, it means the church is everywhere. But one of the features of a state church is that everybody has to pay for it. And so it's like, the police or the fire department. I mean, we pay our taxes, we get that service. Everybody pays for the Church of England, and we assume everybody attends. It's a uniformity. Well, by the time we get into the 1720s, there are a lot of people who felt the Church of England had grown stale. And in the previous century, we had Puritans. and some of you have been with me in other contexts, we talk about Puritans. These are the people who want to purify the church. They want to make it stronger, purify the Catholic elements in it as they saw it. Okay, that's in the 17th century. The 18th century, there's a whole new impetus to reform the Church of England, to make it more evangelical, to make it touch more people, to change more lives. And so the common line then in the 18th century is the Church of England was like a typical day in Scotland. Short and cold. Not everybody felt that way, but a lot of people did. And two of the people who felt the Church of England had grown stale, short and cold, were John and Charles Wesley. Now, it's important to remember they didn't, either one of them intended to leave the church. They're not renegades. They wanted to reform it. They wanted to change it. They wanted to enliven, invigorate the Church of England. So it's important to remember that all that we're talking about with Wesley is a renewal, not a revolution. Now, that would happen in the United States, be an entirely different denomination, but not in England. Okay. So let's begin with John, because he set the pattern. His father was an Anglican priest in a little town called Wroot, W-R-O-O-T, which is part of a little bigger town called Epworth. And you can go visit their home today. And it's in the north part of England. And John's mother was a remarkable woman, Susanna. And we could have a whole, like whole semester on Susanna, all right? She bore 18 children. I said she's a remarkable woman, right? 10 of them survived to adulthood. Now, I know we're thinking about this, the mortality rate. That's just not unusual in the 18th century. You think, we take for granted that our children are going to survive. We take this for granted that we're going to survive. That wasn't the case in the 18th century. So 8 of the 10 died in childhood, infancy. But 10 did survive, and Susanna was remarkable for the way she reared her children. And she was one who had responsibility for it. She was strict. And if she were around today, social services would go after her. No question about that. And she was quite free to use the rod. And if children proved recalcitrant, she was quite free to lock them in the closet until they were willing to change their ways. But she was also a wonderful mother in other ways. Every one of her 10 children grew up learning French, Latin, and German. She was fluent in all 3 languages and determined that her children would be fluent in those languages as well. And sometimes Greek. I had Greek, but French, Latin, German for her children. And also, much to her credit, is that she drew no distinction between her boys and her girls. There are 6 girls, 4 boys. And very unusual in the 18th century to assume that girls could be educated or ought to be educated. Another thing about Susanna that you need to know is that in the midst of all of this, every week she set aside 1 hour to be with one of her children in the evening to go over the week's lessons. So here from her diary. 1711. Molly on Monday, Hetty on Tuesday, Nancy on Wednesday, Jackie on Thursday, Patty on Friday, Charles on Saturday. Blessed be God. 1 for every day of the week and 2 for Sunday. Emily Sue. So this woman is, well, she's so much an 18th century figure, but on the other hand, she's just such an extraordinary figure. Now, as I said, she was not afraid to discipline them. And she would say later in life, she said, my children learned to fear the rod and to cry softly. And John would say later, my mother had 10 children, each of whom had spirit enough, yet not one of them was ever heard to cry aloud after it was 1 year old. So, strict upbringing, and he had a very vigorous one, multiple languages, and presented, open to very much of a wider world. The college for John, and you'll see in a minute, for Charles, was Oxford. Now, we think of Oxford as a bastion of great learning, all right? In the 18th century, that was not the case. Oxford was known as a party school. And you think of it as kind of like it's all fraternities, okay, on Saturday night, sororities. And one observer said that the students and professors, they called them dons, devoted most of their energies to drinking, gaming, and idle talk. This is Oxford in the 18th century. This is the Oxford that John Wesley comes to in the 1720s. He's a reformer. He's unhappy with the Church of England, and he goes to Oxford, where the Anglican clergy are trained, where they are formed, and this is the educational environment he encounters. And he reacts negatively to this and determines that he's going to bring about Reformation. Now, I'll come back to this in a minute because it involves Charles. But let me go ahead and say, where do we get our name? Methodists.
Method to life.
Method of life, but it wasn't a compliment. It was methodical, which was a down, sort of put down. And there are other words we can think about. Could use for people who are so rigorous and so scheduled in their lives. And so it was not a compliment, it's a sneer, but I'll come back to this in a little bit. John is sent by his own relation. He goes after Oxford. He wants to go as a missionary to the most unchristianized, uncivilized place in the world. Where was it?
New York City.
Georgia. Georgia, yeah. Savannah, Georgia. Take it up. And Georgia is a very interesting colony because it was a debtors colony. It was a place that people escaped to if they couldn't pay their debts. English escaped there. And it also was a refuge for orphans. Great orphanage there. So in many ways, it was a very humanitarian place. It was also the place where slavery was not only exercised, but was introduced. It was introduced with a great deal of forethought. So we have this complication, debtors colony, orphans colony, but it's also a colony that features human slavery. It's the 18th century. So John goes to Georgia as a missionary. Things do not work out for him. He got engaged, it didn't work out, he was jilted, and so he comes back to England. Very disappointed. And he's very much in peace with his own personal spiritual life. He gets back to England, he said, I went to the New World to convert the Indians. But who would convert John Wesley? Now, while he is in Georgia, soon thereafter, he begins thinking about a theological system. This is what Charles inherits. And only 3 points I want to talk about. Again, we could spend a whole year talking about this, but we're not going to in just a couple of minutes. 3 main features, 3 kinds of grace. Prevenient grace, justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. Prevenient grace is the grace that prevenes, and think of it as like the porch of a house. All right? Everybody's welcome on the porch. Justifying grace is the door into the house. Open the door and you walk in. Everyone's welcome. But, big but, you've got to make a decision to walk in. And this becomes a hugely controversial claim in the 18th century because the assumption is nobody does anything unless God preordains it. John Wesley says no. We all have the option of walking through that door if we want to. Sanctifying grace. Once we are inside, then it is expected that we will grow in grace. We're going into the kitchen. be fed kitchen. This becomes even more controversial because it's human volition that's involved here. Now, people become sanctified. They become more and more Christ-like over the course of their life. Is it ever completed? Are people ever wholly sanctified? Well, when John was in his 80s, someone asked him if he'd ever known someone who was wholly sanctified. And he smiled and said, well, I've known some who said they were. So, it's just tricky. Okay. John encountered a great deal of opposition. He was a tough guy, and he took it on the chin. And in the course of his long life, he lived his late 80s. He preached 40,000 sermons. And someone has calculated that he rode 250,000 miles on horseback, and he wrote 52 volumes of theology, most of it on horseback. Just a little bit more, give this person a real life texture. He advised young Methodists, always preach your first sermon by 5 a.m. Now, I know Anna does that, but the rest of us don't, right? Who is he preaching to at 5 a.m.? Workers, dock workers, farmers, factory workers, people who have to be at work at 5 a.m. Well, you got more advice. I like this. He said, you can't sleep? Just get up 1 hour earlier each morning. And if you keep doing that, you'll sleep. And my favorite, if you have problems with being, as he put it, too fleshy, avoid butter and focus on vegetables. Makes sense, right? Okay, this is the kind of guy John Wesley was. Now, we come to his baby brother. John was the 15th of 18 kids. Charles was the baby. Born in 1707, died in 1788. His life just beautifully spanned the 18th century. And he's often called the forgotten Wesley. And I think that's a shame. Because I'll say this, I'm kind of teasing. If we hadn't had Charles, we never would have heard of John. Now, I'm sort of teasing about that, but it might be true. There's an element of truth in that. And why is that? How many of us remember John Wesley's sermons point by point? I don't. But a lot of us remember every verse Charles's songs. They are embedded minds in our hearts. And John was very free to say that what his baby brother was doing was every bit as important as anything that he or any other preacher did. Charles embraced not only John's theology, but some other features of John's life he embraced. One, John's passion for renewal of the church. John's passion for perfection, or what I call sanctification. And John's intensity of commitment. All of these Charles accepted, as well as these notions of different kinds of grace. But Charles is a man with slightly different temperament than John. He was called the sweet bard Methodism. And I'll say more about that in a little bit. But where John is a kind of a theological tough guy, in a way. I mean, he's just so rigorous, so determined. And there was no stopping John. With Charles, it's different. He never had personal stamina that John did. He didn't have the kind of body or physique that he could deal with those ordeals as John did. So he was different in that sense. But he was also different in a sense that he was more pastoral than John was. And I'll give you just one example of this. John felt that unless you could testify to an experience of justifying grace, you can't be considered a Christian. If you're still out there on the porch Well, you're out there on the porch and you don't count until you go through that door. John was a rigorist. You're on the bus or off the bus. Charles, no. He said, that's just not the way it works in real life. The way it works in real life is that people inch their way across that porch. Now, I'm using the porch analogy. That is their language. But they inch their way across that porch and they open that door, maybe hesitantly, and they go in and they come back and go in and back. But in real life, it's not that simple. It's not on the bus or off the bus. And here's his pastoral sense. See, he wants to bring the gospel to people as they really are, not as they theoretically ought to be, how they fit in a theological system. This is how they really are. So this was a key difference between John and Charles. Is this temperament, okay? But they're both brilliant. They are academics to their heart. And when Charles goes to Oxford, like his brother, he follows his brother to Oxford. His task, besides going to class, his task is to translate Greek and Latin classics and then to turn them into English verse, poetic form. And I'll skip ahead and say that in the course of his long life, his 80s, he turned every single verse of the Bible into poetry. Now think about that. I mean, some passages in Leviticus be pretty tough, think about how you could turn that into poetry. But Charles did. So he's a brilliant man. He's an extraordinarily gifted man. But John has gone to Oxford ahead of him. And I remember what we talked about Oxford. The character of Oxford is like an ongoing fraternity party. And Charles actually is the first of the two brothers. He's the first to take grave offense what's going on in this college. He determines that he will single-handedly make change. And so among the things that Charles does, and then John joins him. Earlier it was Charles accepting John's theology. Now John is accepting Charles. And so Charles institutes daily communion. By this time he's ordained. So daily communion, intense Bible study every single day. But more than that, and this is what moves me. Charles says, it doesn't do you any good, doesn't do us any good to take communion and intense Bible study if we don't translate that into our hands. So Charles sets up a rigorous program of visiting the sick in person, visiting prisoners in prison, in person, visiting orphans in person, taking food to the poor in person, teaching prisoners how to read, and paying no attention to what crimes that they are accused of, including, in his case, a prisoner who was accused of sodomy, which was just enormously, well, how do I put that, in the 18th century, it's inconceivable that one would minister to someone accused of sodomy. Charles, it doesn't matter. So think about that. Visiting the sick, prisoners, orphans, poor, teaching them to read. When did he go to school? He was a busy man. And John followed him, seeking to do these things. Now transfer all this to, say, something like college scene today. UNC, State, Duke. How are people like this going to be perceived? Not positive. And here's where we get this word Methodists, which was a sneer. It was a put down. These are people who are methodical, or let's go ahead and say it, anal. That's what we moved back to. And there were other terms. They were called Bible moths because they're reading the Bible late at night. What else you gonna do it? And sometimes they were called hit compliments. I have no idea. I mean, Kathy and I grew up in the Ozarks, and we were not. No, she wasn't, but I was known as a hick. Okay, the Ozarks, and I don't know if hick had that meaning in the 17th century, 18th century, but anyway, hit compliment. All of these insults, and the more that John and Charles were insulted, the more determined they were to make sure that they translated their gospel with their hands. Now, John has gone to Georgia. As I said, things were not working out very well for him, and people weren't responding to him. And he had this tempestuous love affair that didn't work out, brokenhearted. So things were not working for him, but Charles goes anyway, just like his brother does. He's going to follow his brother. And Charles is given a different job. His job is to become the personal secretary for the governor of Georgia, who was mainly charged with running the orphanage. And for reasons that